All right, diving right in today. Buckle up, everyone, because we're talking satellite internet in India and all the drama surrounding it.
Oh, absolutely. This is huge, especially with Starlink potentially entering the market.
Yeah, and we're basing this deep dive on some recent reporting from The Hindu, trying to make sense of it all.
Definitely. And for those of you prepping for the UTSC exams, this is like gold.
Seriously.
Hmm.
We're talking technology, regulation, socioeconomic impacts, the digital divide. It's all here.
Right. It's a perfect example of how these things are all connected, and the Hindu really lays it out.
So what's our mission today? We want to figure out Starlink's current status in India.
What's its potential? What roadblocks is it facing? And what does it mean for India's internet future?
Exactly. And one thing that really stood out from The Hindu was this. Airtel and Jio, those big telecom companies.
Yeah, they were initially kind of hesitant about Starlink coming in without those typical spectrum options.
But now they've formed partnerships with Starlink. So what's going on there? It's kind of a head scratcher.
Yeah, it's not likely just a change of heart, right? I think it shows that they see satellite internet as a way to complement their existing services.
You mean targeting specific customers or areas where their current infrastructure isn't as strong?
Exactly. It could also be a strategic move to stay competitive as the internet landscape evolves. It's fascinating.
Totally. So before we get too deep, let's back up a bit. For anyone not totally familiar, what exactly is Starlink?
Imagine like a massive Wi-Fi network in space, right? It's a bunch of satellites, over 7,000 of them.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah, and they orbit pretty close to Earth. It's called low Earth orbit or LEO. These satellites basically beam internet signals down to users.
Okay, so how do I, down here on Earth, actually connect to this space Wi-Fi? What do I need?
You need a special receiver called a ground terminal. It picks up the signals from those passing satellites.
So the satellites are constantly moving.
Yep, providing pretty much global coverage. Then those satellites communicate with ground stations on Earth.
And those ground stations are linked to the regular internet we all use.
Exactly. So even if you're in a remote village in the Himalayas, far from any cell towers, you can get online.
That's pretty amazing. So the Hindu mentioned speeds around 100 Mbps. How does that compare to, say, home broadband?
It's actually quite comparable, but there's this thing called latency, which is the delay in data transmission.
Okay, so even though the speed might be good, there might be a slight lag.
Yeah, that's right. Starlink's latency is improving, but it's still generally higher than wired connections.
So for things like browsing, streaming, video calls, probably fine.
More than likely, yeah. But for things that need super fast responses, like online gaming,
Or maybe some types of financial trading.
right, those might still be better on a wired connection. It depends.
Got it. So where in India would Starlink actually make the biggest difference?
The Hindu makes it clear that in cities, with their 5G and wired broadband,
Yeah, probably not as revolutionary.
right, but in those remote areas where laying down traditional infrastructure is like a nightmare.
Places where it's too expensive or the terrain is too difficult.
Exactly. Starlink could provide almost instant connectivity, which is huge.
So this ties into that whole digital divide issue, right? Providing equal access for everyone.
Absolutely. For India to develop in an inclusive way, everyone needs access to information and communication technologies.
Education, healthcare, economic opportunities, they all rely on being connected.
And Starlink can help bridge that gap between urban and rural areas, which is crucial for the country's progress.
It's not just about everyday internet access, though. The Hindu highlighted some really specific sectors where Starlink could be a game changer.
Oh, for sure. Think about maritime operations, ships, oil rigs, deep sea research. They often struggle with reliable internet.
Yeah, and for people like solo sailors, being able to communicate or call for help is vital.
And in disaster relief, when communication networks are down, Starlink can be deployed quickly.
Like after an earthquake or a flood.
Yeah, it can help establish communication hubs for rescue teams, military aid organizations. It's a lifeline in those situations.
Yeah. It's incredible to think about. But of course, bringing any new technology to India involves dealing with the regulatory landscape.
Right, and the Hindu breaks down the pricing and the hurdles Starlink is facing.
So there's the cost of the user terminal, the hardware you need to receive the signals.
And then the monthly subscription fee, which I don't think we should expect to be significantly cheaper in India.
Because the technology itself is expensive globally.
Exactly. The final pricing will depend on the regulatory discussions and how Starlink adapts to the Indian market, if at all.
Which leads us to the regulatory stuff. The Hindu really emphasized the scrutiny Starlink is under from the Indian government.
Yeah, any service with that kind of reach is going to be looked at carefully, and there are a few key approvals they need.
Like what?
One is the GMPCS authorization. It's basically permission from the government to offer satellite-based communication services in India.
So it's a must-have to operate legally,
Absolutely. And this falls under the new Telecommunications Act of 2023.
which I guess means new rules, new complexities.
Oh, exactly. They're still being formulated, so there's uncertainty about whether Starlink can even get this license under the old regulations.
So it's a waiting game right now.
It seems like it. And then there's the security clearance from the Ministry of Home Affairs.
Obviously a big concern for any country, especially with a company like SpaceX.
Yeah, SpaceX has apparently addressed some concerns about ownership transparency, but who knows where that stands.
Right, it's all a bit hush-hush. And what about those ground stations? I remember the Hindu mentioned those.
Yeah, Starlink needs to set those up in India, and they have to comply with Indian telecom regulations.
Which means what exactly?
Well, under the Telecom Act, they need equipment that lets law enforcement agencies access communications.
Ah, so the government can monitor things.
It's a standard requirement for all internet providers in India.
Makes sense. And then there's the whole debate about spectrum allocation, which seems to be a sticky point.
It is. So the government's stance is that they don't want to auction off satellite spectrum.
Because the technology, with its focus beams, allows for sharing without needy auctions.
That's their argument, yeah. But before these Airtel and Geo partnerships popped up,
The telecom companies were pushing hard for auctions.
especially Reliance Geo, they were pointing to the Supreme Court's 2012 ruling on the 2G spectrum case.
Which basically said scarce resources like spectrum should be auctioned off for transparency and public benefit.
Exactly. So there are definitely different views on how this should be handled.
And it even went as far as Geo getting legal opinions to support their stance on auctions, according to the Hindu.
Yeah, but right now the government's final decision is still pending.
So Starlink is kind of in limbo, waiting to see what happens.
It seems that way. But the Hindu also pointed out that things could move faster than expected.
And because of Elon Musk's influence and the U.S.-India trade situation.
Potentially, yeah. It's a reminder of how intertwined these things are: technology, politics, economics, international relations.
It's never straightforward, is it? So, bottom line, where do things stand with Starlink in India right now?
As of today, no official approvals yet.
Still a lot of hurdles to clear.
But Airtel and Geo signing those commercial agreements with Starlink, that's a big development.
It suggests things might be moving in the right direction, eventually.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It's a complex situation for sure.
All right, for our listeners, especially those prepping for the UTSC exams, let's recap the key takeaways.
Okay, so first?
Understand the technology behind Starlink and how it can connect remote areas.
Yep, that's crucial. Second,
It's particularly relevant for bridging the digital divide in India, which is a big deal for development.
right. And third, those regulatory challenges are substantial. Starlink has a long way to go.
And lastly, no official approvals yet, but those partnerships with Airtel and Geo are a sign that things are shifting.
It's a very dynamic situation, and understanding these nuances is super important for the UPSC.
Absolutely. So as you study, think about how this all connects to broader themes: technology's role in development, government regulation.
The telecom sector, digital infrastructure, it's all related.
And here's a final thought to ponder. How might a successful Starlink integration change India's socioeconomic landscape, especially in rural areas?
And what policy considerations should the government prioritize to make sure this access is equitable and secure for everyone?
Really important questions to think about. All right, if you found this deep dive into Starlink insightful and helpful for your UPSC prep,
Make sure to like and subscribe to the deep dive and drop a comment if you have any questions.
and don't forget to check out the Hindu. They're the source for all this great information.
It's a fantastic resource, definitely worth a read. Thanks for joining us today.
We'll see you next time.